Good morning, students. This is Sampat Bhadu, Assistant Professor of English, Government College, Sri Dungargarh, Bikaner. Today we are going to take up the next poem, Sohrab and Rustum by Matthew Arnold. Let's discuss the poem. Sohrab and Rustum is a blank verse poem, and here it is an extract from Matthew Arnold's long narrative poem, Sohrab and Rustum, published in 1853. In this poem, Arnold has recreated the story originally written by the Persian poet Firdausi. The theme of the poem is highly tragic. The poet portrays the impact of a sad and gloomy situation which occurs unexpectedly. The message conveyed through this narrative is that fate is all powerful and it is beyond the capacity of the individual to know how it works. The poet highlights the finite nature of man's capacities and the infinite stretch of destiny, which unfolds much more than man can even imagine. The poem opens with Sohrab lying wounded with his life gradually escaping from his grasp. His father Rustum stands by him as he oscillates between life and death. The struggle ends and Sohrab lies motionless in the desert with a broken and distressed Rustum by his side. This contrast is symbolic of the fact that nature goes on its way without any regard to the personal tragedy of any person. Not only this, even the armies on both sides resume the war in a routine manner. In the concluding part, the poet shifts his focus from Rustum and Sohrab and depicts the beauty of nature originating from the plateau of Pami. The river Oxus flows majestically in a wavy path till at last its waves merge with the Aral Sea, its final destination. The movement of the river is in fact an implied comment upon the nature of life. Life also originates, and after completing its course like the river, it has to ultimately merge with the infinite. Thus, the poem reaches philosophical heights and explores the nature of mortality. Let's take up the poem. He spoke, and Sohrab smiled on him and took the spear and drew it from his side and eased his wounds imperious anguish, but the blood came welling from the open gash and life flowed with the stream. All down his cold white side the crimson torrent ran, dim now and soiled, like the soiled tissue of white violets left freshly gathered on their native bank by children whom their nurses call with haste indoors from the sun's eye. His head dropped low, his limbs grew slack, motionless, white he lay. White, with eyes closed, only when heavy gasps, deep heavy gasps quivering through all his frame, convulsed him back to life, he opened them and fixed them feebly on his father's face, till now all strength was ebbed, and from his limbs unwillingly the spirit fled away, regretting the warm mansion which it left, and youth and bloom and this delightful world. What a beautiful description over here. And now the spear was pierced in the body of Sohrab. By whom? By Rustum, the father of Sohrab. The spear was pierced in the body of Sohrab, and he was bearing extreme pain. Rustum drew out the spear from his body. The blood gushed out, came out, ran out, and the sand became red. Sohrab began to lose consciousness, and at last he lost his life. During his last moments, he was looking at his father constantly. The poet describes the pathetic scene effectively through the use of several similes. Dear students, it's a narrative poem told in the form of a story of a father and a son, Sohrab and Rustum. Sohrab here is the son and Rustum is the father. Originally, it's a personal story told by Firdausi, and here in the form of this poem, it has been recreated by this Matthew Arnold. What happens, my dears? Once upon a time, Rustum left his wife when Sohrab was unborn, and he left the wife. Wife went away somewhere. He promised that if a boy child takes birth, his arm should be impressed with a mark, and if it is a daughter, it shouldn't be. But what happened? The mother hid this fact. He did not send any message to Rustum about the birth of the boy. She impressed the arm of the child with a mark, with a sign. With the passage of time, Rustum and Sohrab, both of them were in the armies of opposite sides. They came into contact during the battle, and Rustum, in a combat, stabbed his son Sohrab fatally. Now, Rustum is sad simply because he saw that sign on the arm of his own son and he recognized, oh my God, this is my own son and I have stabbed him. What a great sin I have committed. Now he is regretting, he is repenting, but in vain. Sitting by the side of his son, the son is fatally wounded by him. He is on the verge of death. The father is repenting, regretting very deeply. So, dear students, this pathetic scene has been described vividly, depicted very picturesquely over here through this poem by Matthew Arnold. Let's discuss the first stanza. Rustum looked at Sohrab's face for a few minutes and then spoke. My son, I wish that the day predicted by you should come soon, and I wish that the sea in which I will be drowned should be really very deep. Till that day comes, I will put up with my misery if it is fortune's decree that I should put up with it. When Rustum had finished speaking, Sohrab smiled at him and taking hold of the spear, he pulled it out of his side, thus abated the terrible and excruciating pain of the wound received by him. But his blood came bubbling out of the open wound wound, and his life started flying out with the stream of blood. The dark red blood flowed down his cold white side, now dimmed in color and slightly dirtied like the tarnished fabric of white cold violet flowers, left lying down on the ground after being freshly plucked from their native bed where they had bloomed by children, as their nurses called them in a hurry indoors, away from the glaring heat of the sun, under which they had been playing. The head of Sohrab fell down very low on the ground. His limbs lost their firmness and went limp as they lay, without any movement, growing all over with his eyes shut on account of weakness. He opened his eyes only when labored and heavy, spasmodic, quick inspiration and expiration of life giving air shook his entire body like the flickers of a dying candle and brought him back to life for a short while before finally being driven into the jaws of death. And then he fixed them, his eyes, on his father's face in a weak and pathetic manner. By now, all his strength had been seeped away from his limbs, and finally, his unwilling spirit, which was feeling sorry for being compelled to leave this delightful world and its warm house, the body, which is the house of soul, adorned with the flower like freshness of youth in its prime, flew away to the next world, and Sohrab gave up the ghost. Next. So on the bloody sand, Sohrab lay dead, and the great Rustum drew his horseman's cloak down over his face and sat by his dead son. As those black granite pillars, once high reared by Jamshids in Persepolis to bear his house, now mid their broken flights of steps, lie prone, enormous down the mountain side. So in the sand lay Rustum by his son. And night came down over the solemn waste, and the two gazing hosts, and that sole pair, and darkened all, and a cold fog with night crept from the oxes. Soon a hum arose, as of a great assembly loosed, and fires began to twinkle through the fog. For now both armies moved to camp and took their meal. The Persians took it on the open sands southward, the Tartars by the river Mars, and Rustum and his son were left alone. Let's take up the stanza again. So on the bloody sand, Sohrab lay dead, and the great Rustum drew his horseman's cloak down over his face and sat by his dead son, as those black granite pillars, once high reared by Jamshid in Persepolis to bear his house, now mid their broken flights of steps, lie prone, enormous, down the mountain side. So in the sand lay Rustum by his son. And night came down over the solemn waste, and the two gazing hosts, and that sole pair, and darkened all, and a cold fog with night crept from the oxes. Soon a hum arose, as of a great assembly loosed, and fires began to twinkle through the fog. For now both armies moved to camp and took their meal. The Persians took it on the open sands southward, the Tartars by the river Mers, and Rustum and his son were left alone. Thus, in this stanza, we see that Sohrab is lying dead on the sand and Rustum is sitting near him, feeling gloomy and sad. Evening fell and the night also fell down. Both the armies took their dinner. Nature was also silent on the grief of father and son. Thus on the blood-soaked sand Sohrab lay down, stone dead, and the great warrior Rustum, hiding his face in his riding cloak, sat by the side of his dead son. Rustum threw himself down on the sand by the side of his son, and lay there in the same way as those huge pillars of granite stone, which once stood very high and straight when the Emperor Jamshid had got them built in his capital city Persepolis to support his huge palace, and which now, when ages have gone by, lie flat in ruins. Measuring their huge length down the mountain side over which they had been built, in the middle of the steps of that broken staircase, which at one time they had supported. In this manner did Rustum lie in the sand. Finally, the night threw its cloak of darkness all over that desolate and dreadful desert, and also over the two horror-struck armies and the single pair of Sohrab and Rustum. And with the nightfall, a cold mist slowly rose from the surface of the river Oxus. Very soon there was heard a universal buzz of low talk, as we hear when a huge assembly ends and people leave the place in small groups, talking in low voices, and small fires began to shine dimly through mist in front of each tent, because now both armies moved back to their camps and started taking their evening meal. The Persians took their meal on the desert in the open air towards the south, while the Tartars took their meal by the side of the river bank, and Rustum and his son were left alone for the time being. Let's take up the next and last stanza. But the majestic river floated on out of the mist and hum of that low land into the frosty starlight, and there moved, rejoicing, through the hushed Corasmian waste under the solitary moon. He flowed right for the polar star, past Organze, brimming and bright and large. Then sands begin to hem his watery march and dam his streams and split his currents, that for many a league that shone and parcelled Oxus strains along through beds of sand and matted rushy isles. Oxus, forgetting the bright speed he had in his high mountain cradle in Pamir, a foiled circuitous wanderer, till at last the longed-for dash of waves is heard, and wide his luminous home of waters opens, bright and tranquil, from whose floor that new bathed stars emerge and shine upon the Aral Sea. In this last stanza, the poet tells us that river Oxus kept flowing as before, as if nothing had happened. Just as river meets in the sea, human soul also meets to God ultimately. In this stanza, similarity between the river and human life is very much clear. The royal river, now dear students, the great, amidst the tragic scene, we have an unaffected scene of nature. That nature is completely unaffected, or regardless of this tragic scene that occurred unexpectedly when Father Rustum stabbed and wounded his own son, Sohrab. But on the other hand, nature is moving. Here, the river Oxus is described picturesquely. River Oxus is flowing unaffectedly, as if nothing happened over there. But the royal river Oxus kept flowing onward out of the fog and buzzing whispers of the low-lying terrain into the frosty light of the stars, and there moved happily through the silent waste land of Khorasma, a region of Turkestan, under the lonely moon. The Oxus flowed on due north in the direction of the pole star, going past Orgenje, a village on the Oxus, some 70 miles below Khiva and near the head of its delta. Brimful of water, shining brightly and growing larger. From that point outwards, the sands of the desert start pulling obstacles in the way of its forward flow, stop its currents and break them into divided streams, so that for miles together Oxus labors along with difficulty, divided into small parts and derived of its old speed. Glory through beds of sands and islands surrounded by intertwined sweeps of rushes, the Oxus forgets its bright earlier speed that it had in its mountain cradle on the plateau of Pamir, where it was born as a small spring, turning into a tired traveler who has wandered far out of his way and is moving through a puzzling maze or till labyrinth, till at last the dashing sound of much desired union of its waves with the sea is heard, and the brightly shining and wide home of waters of different rivers. The Aral Sea opens up before the Oxus in its bright and calm shape, the Aral Sea from whose bottom rise the newly bathed stars. As the stars appear on the horizon, they seem to have come up out of the sea and then shine upon it. Dear students, in the last stanza, the poet describes the beauty of nature, that nature is emotionless. It doesn't have any emotions with the human life. And you know, human life has been compared with the passage of the river. That river originates, it flows, and ultimately, eventually, it merges with the infinite, that is the sea. Likewise, human life is also originates, means we take birth, we move forward on this earth, we live our life, and then eventually we also merge into the infinite. In the last stanza, the poet delineates picturesquely, vividly, the beauties of nature. The river flows on its own way, in its own way, without being affected by the tragic scene. It is not moved, rather, it flows continuously and eventually it merges with the Aral Sea, and that is infinite. And the river loses its identity over there. Likewise, human being also. While the human being is alive, it has its own identity. We have our own identity. But the moment we die, we merge with the infinite and we lose our identity. Our spirit flows away from our body, from this room. Here, the poem reaches to the heights of the philosophical note. That's all for today, and have a nice day. Thank you.